Water, dihydrogen monoxide, the universal solvent. This important molecule has many different names, but it remains one of the most essential elements for supporting life. Water covers approximately 71% of the Earth's surface. However, despite being so abundant, it remains vulnerable to contamination. One of the most concerning aspects of water pollution is plastic. Plastic threatens aquatic life and ecosystems by being a choking hazard. But this kind of pollution pales in comparison to another increasingly dangerous form of pollution, nitrogen runoff. Nitrogen is another critical element on our planet that composes 78% of the Earth's atmosphere. While also crucial to life, an abundance of nitrogen can be extremely deadly, especially when it accumulates in the Earth's oceans and not the atmosphere. Nitrogen is one of the three nutrients that contribute to the overarching issue of nutrient runoff. Nutrient runoff refers to the flow of three nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, into the water, while nitrogen runoff refers specifically to nitrogen. However, nitrogen remains the most difficult of the bunch to manage, for a variety of reasons. Nitrogen runoff results primarily from fertilizer overuse or misuse on large-scale farms. Our current population demands the use of fertilizers to produce more, higher-quality crops to feed an increasing population. For farmers, using more fertilizer only promises to improve harvests at the cost of buying fertilizer. The byproduct of that process is that the excess fertilizer eventually runs off with rainwater and sprinkler systems into larger and larger bodies of water. The escaping nitrogen can often be contained by the environment itself through areas called natural filters. These filters are filled with trees and grasses that can safely capture nitrogen. Expanding farms and the process of clearing land reduces the number of natural filters that can alleviate this issue of nitrogen runoff. This runoff also experiences contributions from more commercial waste, like fossil fuels. The release of fossil fuels into the atmosphere contributes to a process called the nitrogen cascade, otherwise known as the nitrogen cycle. In this cycle, nitrogen moves across the planet, spanning aquatic and airborne environments through an effect called deposition. Nitrogen released into the air can be deposited onto the ground, where it eventually finds its way into the water again. Via this process, increased fossil fuels can worsen nitrogen runoff by depositing additional nitrogen into bodies of water. These two main causes contribute to the primary effect of nitrogen runoff, which is the overgrowth of algae. Algae is a plant-like organism that thrives in an abundance of elements like nitrogen. When too many nutrients exist in any body of water, algae grows to use the increased levels of nutrients until algae levels reach critical levels. Coincidentally, like the percentage of nitrogen in the atmosphere, 78% of the U.S. coastal waters are also considered to be suffering from algae overgrowth. When too much algae exists in water, it drains the environment of oxygen. That is the same oxygen that fish need to breathe. This entire process of excess nitrogen leading to reduced oxygen in water is called eutrophication. The term eutrophication encompasses the whole chain of causes and effects that can harm the environment. One tangible effect of reduced oxygen within water is the formation of something called a dead zone. Dead zones are areas of water where so much oxygen is removed by algae that other life simply cannot exist there. Anything remaining in those areas is either something dead or something inanimate. Another tangible effect of algae is the release of carbon dioxide. Through an intake of oxygen, algae releases carbon dioxide into the water. This creates a dangerous impact of altering the pH levels of the body of water. Specifically, algae can cause water pH levels to drop and lead to acidification. This process of coastal acidification poses a significant threat to coral reefs and other aquatic ecosystems. Thirdly, increased algae growth can also increase the risk of toxin creation. Algae grows and spreads by blooming, which can rarely become dangerous. When eaten, this toxic algae can create a cascading effect upon food chains within an ecosystem. This algae can also create a disturbing phenomenon called red tides, where so much red toxic algae exists that it alters the nearby water color to a reddish hue. When consumed, toxic algae can create respiratory and nervous system damage. These environmental impacts greatly impact human life. However, there are some effects that primarily affect humans. Excess nitrogen, not algae creation, can be effectively regulated in large public water systems. But in smaller water systems and private well systems that exist in more agricultural areas, where this nitrogen runoff issue is the worst, they are more often poorly regulated. This contaminated water can reach dangerous levels, causing a myriad of effects, including different forms of cancer, tumors in organs, birth defects, and central nervous system damage. While these occurrences remain relatively rare, the danger lies in the inability to spot the excess nitrogen besides an abundance of algae. These harmful impacts can become an enormous cost to society. One expansive study undertaken in the early 2000s calculated the annual cost of nitrogen runoff to be around $210 billion. This includes a rough estimate of all the short and long-term impacts of nitrogen runoff. One difficulty experienced in the study and in real life is the difficulty of tracing health complications to algae and excess nitrogen specifically. Similarly, treating water tainted with toxic algae for consumption can increase treatment costs up to a multiple of 50. Waters contaminated with excess nitrogen, and therefore algae, also suffer a severe loss of value and can significantly harm fishing industries. Property values with clean water can be boosted by up to 25% versus waters with an abundance of nitrogen algae. As one might expect, solving this issue has a variety of obstacles that prevent its completion, including unwillingness to impose mandatory measures, tracing difficulties, and mitigation costs. Currently, the only mandatory solutions focus on preserving human life instead of environmental health, like water treatment standards. One example of these is the Safe Drinking Water Act. This act sets limits on how high levels of different contaminants may be. These contaminants include both organic and inorganic substances. The 90 plus limits are controlled by the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, which can change them as research and understanding improve. These regulations only apply to public water systems and large private water systems, leaving about 14% of U.S. households drinking water uncovered by this law. The current legislation that addresses the issue of nitrogen runoff in the environment is the Clean Water Act. This act allows the EPA to regulate the levels of emissions into waters from all sources besides agriculture. While one of the most difficult to regulate, agriculture remains the largest source of nitrogen pollution in water and is the source of nitrogen runoff. With this authority, the EPA has set what is called TMDLs, which stand for Total Maximum Daily Load. These plans set a limit on how many levels of pollutants can enter a body of water in one day. One currently exists for the nearby Chesapeake Bay and was created nearly a decade ago. One of the few non-mandatory solutions is a federal program that incentivizes the implementation of mitigation measures and reduced fertilizer use. However, this federal program provides nowhere near the funding and localized solution that state governments need to provide to fix this issue. Fortunately, a large number of solutions have been studied and proposed for implementation across several state plans. The single most effective area of nitrogen mitigation is currently within wastewater treatment. Many of the individual state plans within the Chesapeake Bay TMDL have wastewater goals that have already been exceeded, including the state of Virginia. Wastewater treatment uses a process called biological nutrient removal, or BNR. This method involves exposing water to microorganisms that can remove some nutrients from the water. These treatment methods and appropriate facilities are also responsible for removing the majority of nitrogen left by humans on the land. Another one of the treatment methods is the enhanced nutrient removal method, or the ENR. While using a similar process, ENR is more effective at removing nutrients, but remains more costly to implement, so it is not always the most viable option. These sorts of treatment centers exist in municipalities or cities where bigger concentrations of humans use sources of potentially contaminated water from lakes and rivers, while also releasing nitrogen alongside other elements through industrial means. Other treatment facilities exist for these industrial factories that use many of the same processes, but focus on removing nitrogen along with other dangerous chemicals like mercury. One method that some states use to manage industrial waste is a nutrient trading program that behaves similarly to carbon emissions. Factories with lower level of emissions, in this case nitrogen release, receive more nutrient credits that can be bought and sold should nitrogen levels drop below a certain level. Back to specifically nitrogen runoff, probably the most intuitive solution would fall under the category of nutrient management. Nutrient management relies on a large variety of factors that should be altered based on location, soil type, weather type, and other influences. In order to effectively use nutrient management, the right rate of fertilization needs to be determined by taking soil sample tests. Secondly, not all kinds of fertilizer are equally effective in minimizing nitrogen runoff. In a simplified explanation, different kinds of fertilizers have different chemical structures that make up the fertilizer. Using nitrogen as one of the structural components allows it to only be released during decomposition. Another way to effectively manage nitrogen is by how it is spread. The most common method is to use a sprinkler type system that spreads the fertilizer in circles. This method causes fertilizer to accumulate near the middle of the circle when compared to full width spreaders that evenly disperse the fertilizer. Full width spreaders are significantly more expensive, but are much more effective in spreading fertilizer. Also, fertilizer needs to be spread before crops are planted so that it can be entirely absorbed by the soil. Lastly, the timing of the fertilizer is important in reducing nitrogen runoff. Different crops have different times in their growth cycle where fertilizer use can be more effectively controlled without releasing abundant amounts of nitrogen. Another practice to reduce runoff besides nutrient management is conservative drainage. A variety of methods exist that are useful in a variety of settings, including differences in soil, elevation, location, precipitation, and crop type. These kinds of practices always have some sort of agricultural ditch to help capture runoff water so the excess nitrogen cannot easily escape. Yet another effort that can be made to reduce the levels of nitrogen runoff is actually by planting additional crops. Planting year-round cover crops is relatively inexpensive and has other benefits, including replenishing the soil so that it can better grow the real crops. Covering fields with low-cost plants or perennials helps to prevent soil erosion and leads to more effective capture of nitrogen in the subsequent season. Another method of reducing runoff is actually in the tilling of the soil itself. Using a method called conservative tillage, the goal is to disturb or move as little soil as possible while making room for the crops. By disturbing as little soil as possible, the maximum amounts of things like plant and organic residue can remain on and in the soil to help absorb nutrients. Some different methods of conservative tillage include minimum tillage, ridge tillage, and direct seeding. A fifth potential method to reduce nitrogen runoff is actually geared towards livestock and not fertilizer. Limiting livestock's access to water sources like rivers is proven to help plant buffers grow around these waters. Without being constantly trampled, grasses can grow on river borders to help capture some nitrogen before it enters the water and finds its way into the oceans. This also has the effect of preventing soil erosion along rivers and lakes, and remains a very low cost and low maintenance method because it only requires that animals be drinking from natural bodies of water in certain areas. Lastly, the most effective solution by far is the practice of using vegetative filter strips. Filter strips of only 15 feet can reduce nitrogen pollution in soil types found in Virginia by more than 50%. 50% amounts of reduction could easily achieve any and all goals of nitrogen runoff. Looking at this issue on a larger scale, the United States as a whole is still increasing their usage of fertilizers, while China remains the largest producer and consumer of fertilizers. Understandably, no real agricultural pollution laws exist on a global stage, so the increasing populations of individual countries continues to threaten the safety and health of our waters. Narrowing down to individual states, the state of Virginia is currently on track with nitrogen reduction goals following the current TMDL plan for the Chesapeake Bay. However, almost the entirety of this progress has come from wastewater treatment plant upgrades. The current plan calls for a total of 7 million pounds of nitrogen reduction from agriculture. To put this into perspective, Virginia has only successfully achieved a little under 200,000 pounds of nitrogen reduction in the past decade. Because the plan is supposed to be accomplished by 2025, the state of Virginia is far behind its nitrogen reduction goals in the area of agriculture. This relative inaction has left the current state plans to be achievable only by increasing state funding for this issue by a multiple of 5. However, the case remains that agricultural nitrogen issues can be ignored to achieve the TMDL if wastewater upgrades continue to take place. The state with the most concerning data for the Chesapeake Bay is that of Pennsylvania. This state provides the most nitrogen runoff of the group of 6 states in the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, and has a current state plan that does not even meet the levels set by the EPA. The lack of state spending has made the issue more complex, because tracking systems and other spending needs require funding over longer periods of time to install. To conclude, this issue suffers greatly from insufficient state funding that does receive some federal assistance. The issue is that state funding has to increase by such a large margin that real action has to be taken at either the state or federal government levels to greatly support the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. Should this plan fail to be met, Chesapeake Bay water restoration becomes exponentially more difficult to accomplish, which is why this issue is so urgent. The agricultural industry needs funding and regulation to help accomplish these goals on state levels, so that nitrogen runoff can be kept out of our waters and algae levels kept to a minimum. Thank you for watching.